Hi, just want to follow up on yesterday's session. We talked about the Paul Revere's ride in the battles of Lexington and Concord, and I made the comment that the trip back for the British was quite brutal. And so I thought I'd break out one of my favorite authors, Nathaniel Philbrick, and his book on Bunker Hill. And he has some quotes in here. I just wanted you to hear them so you could get an understanding. And these are, some of these are quotes. It was a ruthless kind of fighting that even the experienced soldiers on both sides found profoundly troubling. Instead of a proper battlefield to contain the horror, they were fighting amid homes and farms. The people say, according to the Reverend William Gordon, that the soldiers are worse than the Indians, referring to the Native Americans who kept attacking them. Sergeant John Ford of Chelmsford had fought in the French and Indian War, so had Charles Furbish of Andover. At one point, they came upon a regular stealing valuables from a roadside home. And together they rushed into the house and killed the soldier. So they were even taking time to rob homes while they were retreating to Boston. Furbish later told his grandson, at one point they came upon a fallen grenadier who was a British soldier who had been stabbed again and again by passing militiamen. Remembering the day when they called these men companions in arms, not but 12 years earlier, the two veterans lifted up the dying soldier and gave him a drink of water. So it was a quite brutal retreat for the to Boston by the British, and the regulars suffered greatly at the hands of the militiamen. So now we're going to switch. We're still in Boston, and eventually we're going to get out of Boston. I think by next week we'll be out of Boston and on to New York City. But the siege of Boston was quite something. So Boston then doesn't look like Boston today. So you had what looked like this, and I'll explain all this to you in just a second. So this was Boston itself, and out here was Boston, the bay, and the British ships were all in here, and the soldiers were all in here. Okay, this was Charlestown, and this was part of Boston. It was called Dorchester Heights. Okay, and we're gonna discuss these more tomorrow. But on April the 19th, we had like 3,000 militiamen. And so these militiamen were coming from Lexington and Concord, coming in this direction, and the leaders decided that they were going to put a siege on Boston, meaning that all those soldiers, the British soldiers that were in Boston, could no longer come this way. They couldn't escape by land. They couldn't go and forage for wood and food. So they formed a line like this that kept the British soldiers in Boston, and they were up here. And so that was considered the siege of Boston. So you had Admiral, I forgot what his name was, and then you had General Gates and General Howe were sitting on these ships down here, and they decided, since the militia weren't up here, this is Bunker Hill. Up here was Bunker Hill, and then just below that was Breed's Hill. And so, which is actually the spot where the Battle of Bunker Hill took place, was on Breed's Hill, and we'll talk about that in just a day or two. But anyway, this was vacant. And so after this siege, these generals decided that they would go this way to get out, which led to the Battle of Bunker Hill. Later, we'll talk about Dorchester and Dorchester Heights and George Washington. So this was April of 1775. The Battle of Bunker Hill was in June of 1775. And in July of 1775, George Washington, the new commander of the Continental Army, arrives and takes over the siege and starts directing. Now these guys, these were farmers, and they weren't professional shoulders. So they just kind of were hanging out here and not very orderly. It was a real mess, and Washington was kind of disappointed in what he had seen. I think he was thinking he was going to see a well regulated militia, which he was used to in Virginia. They acted like soldiers. These gents, they pretty much didn't do anything. They drank, they were filthy. And so Washington laid out some rules. So now what you have is you have all these British soldiers in Boston, okay, and then you have more soldiers, about 2,000, on these ships, and there's a bunch of little islands that they're on out here. So the British had no place to go. The only way that they could leave was by sea. They had to go out, and eventually they do that. We'll talk about that. So here you have Boston and the siege of Boston in April, May, and June of 1775. So since then, just so you all know, this has all been kind of filled in a little bit, and this is filled in, and there's big skyscrapers here, even over in here. But we don't need to talk about that. So there's the siege of Boston. British over here on this little spit of land, and all the militia over here, keeping them from their food and from the wood that they would need for the winter, upcoming winter. So there you go. Siege of Boston. More tomorrow.